Since its introduction in October 2001, the iPod has had a meteoric rise. It's gone from an idea to over 70 million sold worldwide. This is the story of how it changed an industry and became a cultural phenomenon. Beginning with Steve Jobs' return to the company he co-founded.
Thank you very much.
Through the birth of the idea.
Music was the perfect synthesis for Apple.
And its nerve-wracking development.
For the 8 months of development on the iPod, it was extremely tense.
To the simple stroke of luck that helped transform the iPod from a tech gadget into an icon.
No company had ever cared before about the color of the darn earbuds. But all of a sudden, that became a symbol, and people are like, what is that?
This is the inside story of the iPod. The iPod started with a smile. On the 20th of December 1996, Steve Jobs was smiling.
Thank you very much.
That was the day it was announced he would return to Apple. More than 11 years after being banished from the company he had co-founded.
It's a wonderful Shakespearean story. I mean, it really is. Steve had left Apple in 1985 because of a coup that he tried to foment against John Sculley. John Sculley had been handpicked by Steve to run Apple, and then the two men came to loggerheads. The company had spent years not knowing what to do. Under John Sculley, it had floundered around, tried to continue to build Macs, not gone anywhere.
When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, Apple had been losing $1 billion a year. Its stock had fallen from about $60 a share to $17 a share. To a lot of people in the industry, a lot of very smart people, it really looked like Apple was in a death spiral.
The brand was limping. The products were terrible. They were uncompetitive. Some of the strongest loyalists of the Apple brand were beginning to defect to Microsoft. It's a terrible, terrible state. In fact, the board was thinking of selling Apple and closing shop. When Steve Jobs returned, it was like the return of the Messiah.
When Jobs came back, he knew he had to make changes. He started by slashing Apple's overgrown product line. Among the casualties, the Newton, Apple's foray into the PDA market.
Okay, when Steve got back to Apple, the first thing he did was can the Newton. The Newton had been a handheld machine built by Sculley, early days with handwriting recognition. It was sort of cool in some ways, but it didn't have Steve's imprint on it. It had John Sculley's imprint. He wasn't about to go put a lot of money behind that.
Jobs then reduced the number of projects in development from 50 to 10.
When he got back to Apple, he took a look at all the products that Apple had and essentially called in the engineers, and to each one of them said, you know, take a look at this. What's wrong with this product? And so everyone sort of hummed and hawed. And Steve said, well, I'll tell you what's wrong. They're crap.
When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he had a bit of a reign of terror where he would meet people on campus and he would say, who are you? What do you do? So stories went around about Steve Jobs bumping into people he didn't know on elevators in campus. And by the time the elevator door opened, the people were fired.
Steve wasn't looking to create a particular product. It wasn't this big plan to do this one thing. What it was to create a milieu, create an environment where the right thing will pop into your head and you'll just be hit with it like a thunderbolt. Steve has said many times, and I think he's right about this, you can't ask somebody what they want next. They don't know. They can't tell you what they're going to want next. They just know when they see it that it's going to be the right thing.
He had to change the way the outside world viewed Apple, the way customers viewed Apple, and the way the people who worked at Apple thought about the place. So Jobs did the now famous Think Different advertising campaign. It wasn't just an ad campaign. Before, everyone looked at Apple and said, here's a company that has a tiny percentage of the market. They're losers. They're on the margins. And that this is a bad thing to be. And Jobs comes in and he reframes the notion. And he says, no, it's good to be in the 1 or 2% of people who are original thinkers, who are mavericks, who are innovators.
But changing the company culture was just the first step. The real test was whether Jobs and Apple could create products that would actually sell. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple Computer in 1996, he quickly created a new image for the company and transformed the corporate environment. Success soon followed. In May 1998, Apple released a product that reflected Jobs' new energizing spirit. The iMac was a hit.
Despite a loyal following, the obituary notices began to appear, but guess what? Mac is back.
The colourful all-in-one computer seemed to perfectly match the new digital lifestyle of the young and the youthful. In just 45 days, Apple sold nearly 300,000 iMacs. It was an impressive debut.
They looked so good, you kind of want to lick them.
The launch of the iMac was really important in setting the groundwork for the coming of the iPod, because the iMac was the first kind of new computer to hit a home run with youth culture. And so when all other computer products were boring and gray, he gave them basically a cool fashion computer product, and they'd never seen anything like that before.
While the iMac was a step in the right direction, it was still just another computer. The most important catalyst for the iPod was a phenomenon that was completely unexpected and took the world by storm. It began in a university dormitory in Boston, Massachusetts.
Sean Fanning was a freshman at Northeastern University in Boston in 1998, and he had a roommate who, like many people, liked listening to MP3s. But the roommate complained to him that he could never find them. There'd be a list of links on mp3.com or some other site, and then he'd click through, and the link would be gone. It would be dead. He couldn't hear the music.
Here's this young college kid, and he has a very basic need. He wants to share music with his friends. It's pretty basic. And there was no service out there giving him what he wanted. So he just created it.
Sean Fanning invented a piece of software that allowed users to share MP3 files across the internet. He named it after his own online nickname, Napster.
When Sean released it, it was really released to his friends, and then his friends gave it to his friends, and then their friends. It went from 50 people to 1,000, and then the next week it was at 2,000, and then it started to grow logarithmically. So I think by the end of a month, we were already pushing 10,000 users.
Within a year, Napster was being used by more than 60 million people around the world, making it the fastest growing company in history and public enemy #1 of the recording industry.
The record industry was absolutely terrified of Napster. They'd been tracking it for months before they sued. There was a meeting where all the heads of the record industry were together with Hillary Rosen, and she said, let's do a little demonstration.
I had a number of the record label heads in the room. These were the ultimate music men and women of the industry. And we literally sat there for, 45 minutes while they threw out names of obscure songs and hit songs and everything they could think of, literally playing sort of Find That Tune. And every single thing they named was available from somewhere on Napster. And those guys just walked out of the room blown away.
A federal court judge granted a temporary injunction against Napster, pending a trial on charges by the recording industry that Napster violates copyright laws by stealing artists' songs.
Whilst the record companies succeeded in shutting Napster down, one thing became perfectly clear. A digital music revolution had begun. Steve Jobs took note.
Once it dawned on Steve and his executives that this thing was happening on the internet with music, they knew that they had been missing an opportunity. They did photos, movies, and it was really not until a second iteration of the iMac that the iMac became something that you could burn CDs on and use music on.
Steve knew that Napster was a giant success. He knew that this was happening. Steve was looking for some way to manage songs, to manage music. He wanted Apple users to have a product that enabled you to take your CDs, put them into a Mac, rip the song, and play them back.
Apple found, a company which was actually populated by former Apple people that made a product called Sound Jam. And Sound Jam was taken in, and within a few months, they transformed that program into something that looked like a Mac program, and that was called iTunes.
In January 2001, Jobs took the stage at the Macworld Expo to announce iTunes, Apple's jukebox software. It was the company's first step into the digital music realm.
Steve Jobs' keynote presentation is like a Rolling Stones show.
Thank you all for coming.
You may have seen a lot over the years, but you never want to miss one. In the year 2001, he came to Macworld and brought iTunes, which was the first Macintosh jukebox. This was something that really pushed the limits of what a jukebox could do. It was more beautiful. It was easier to use than anything, either on the Macintosh certainly, but also in the Windows world. And you knew right then that Apple was deep in the game in digital music.
To us, at its core, it's all about the music.
For Steve, music was the natural thing. It was the perfect synthesis for Apple because Steve understood that music was part of our DNA. I mean, computer, let's be honest, is sort of a 20th century thing. Typing on a keyboard and looking at a screen, and it's not an intuitive, primal thing. Music is a primal thing. It's something that's been with human beings since drums in the jungle. So, this was something where if he could pull it off right, he could take the digital world, marry it to that primal thing, and make something really important.
That digital primal thing would transform Apple. But it would take more than iTunes to bring about the change.
iTunes was a way to move your files around and to organize your files on your computer. But what did you really want to do? You wanted to be able to wander around with the songs. You want to be tethered to your desk. You want to go jogging. Steve realized this, and he sent his team out to look at the MP3 marketplace. And what was available was not anything that any of them would like. In fact, they stank.
There was a flash-based one from Diamond, the Rio. There was the Eiger MP Man, the first MP3 player. There was one hard drive-based player from Compaq. But they were expensive, and people really didn't know about them.
What was fascinating was that the one electronics company that should have figured it out, Sony, had completely dropped the ball. Sony, who had built the original portable music player that became a worldwide phenomenon, had completely missed this market.
When Napster opened the door, everybody in the business should have said, holy smoke, here's this huge opportunity. How do we service this audience?
Now, Steve knew that Sony didn't have this product. They hadn't figured it out. Thought, wow, there's a real opportunity here. We could build something better than anybody's got.
By early 2001, Apple executives had decided to enter the MP3 player market. An independent engineer named Tony Fadell was trying to do the same.
Apple at the time was looking to get into the MP3 player market, and along came this independent contractor, Tony Fadell. He'd worked at Philips and General Magic, and he'd been developing handheld devices for them. And his idea was to make a hard drive MP3 player that was also tied to an online store.
Apple wanted to build an MP3 player, and I think Steve had already decided this was a fertile area. So there's this guy, Tony Fadell, around who's got an idea. The guys at Apple decided, look, we could either build it ourselves, take a year or two to get it out there. Or just like we started iTunes with Sound Jam's design, we could put our own magic around it, and we could have a product out in a much more rapid time frame.
The same month that iTunes was launched, Steve Jobs made a momentous decision. Under heavy secrecy, he assembled a team to develop the iPod. Jobs set a near impossible deadline. He wanted the device ready for the holiday season, only 9 months away.
The Apple iPod development schedule was about 9 months, and it was extremely tense. There was no pizza parties. It was show up on Saturday, show up on Sunday, work all week. It was a very, very tight schedule. So about a month into the project, we fly down to Cupertino to meet with the Apple folks. There's about maybe a dozen of the Apple executives in the room. And Tony Fadell storms into the room and he says, folks, this is the project that's going to remake Apple. In 10 years, this is going to be a music business, not a computer business.
Initially, Steve Jobs wasn't that involved until it started to come together. And towards the end, the meetings went from weekly to daily, and he became very, very involved.
Steve used to give a lot of feedback on the audio. He has a very gifted knack for detecting harmonics. He could tell you right away if it sounds good, if it doesn't sound good. He would give reports back to us that the buttons weren't clicking fast enough, or you couldn't get to the song you wanted in less than 3 clicks.